My name is Michael Goldberg, and I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve University. I also am a professor at Weatherhead. And it is great to welcome our friend, an old friend of mine, Jon Dolin, to our alumni speaker series. Our mutual friend, Brian Sokol, who's a colleague at the university, scouts out. I said, Brian, keep an eye out. Who would be cool entrepreneurs to have join? And he recommended Jon Dolin. I'm like, I grew up with Jon Dolin. Perfect. So these sessions are sometimes just a good excuse for me to see old friends. So Jon and I probably haven't seen each other since high school-ish, but we've known each other for a long time. So it's
our fathers grew up together too.
That is true. That is true. And Jon's dad, Larry, was a big supporter of entrepreneurship in Cleveland, entrepreneur. And actually, both of our dads were early supporters of the original Jumpstart, which is a nonprofit in Cleveland that we do a lot of work with. So yeah, small world. All of our sessions are, for those who are joining for the first time, are moderated by students. So we have Neha, who's an awesome student in Chicago, undergrad at Weatherhead, who's just completing her a remote entrepreneurship project program with another alum, Nikki Filippo, and Veale. So Neha, thank you for agreeing to moderate this discussion. We really appreciate it. I will turn it over to you to kind of run the show. So for anybody who's on Zoom, just let us know, let Neha know in the chat if you have a question that you wanted to ask Jon. We also, Jon, have folks watching on LinkedIn Live. So for those that are watching on LinkedIn Live and you have a question, just put it in the comments, and Doug and I and Elizabeth will make sure that Neha sees it. So we'll look forward to the conversation. So with that, Neha, let me turn it over to you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and especially thank you for Jon for joining us here today. I know we're all looking forward to hearing about your rise to CEO and your thoughts on the pandemic's effect on the food and beverage sector as we know it. As Michael mentioned before, I am a management and economics student at Case. I'm particularly interested in exploring economic trends, determining which patterns are merely reflections of our current circumstance and which ones are here to stay. I know the food and beverage sector is a major engine in our economy, so I was very curious to meet Jon and speak with him about his experience. So Jon, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your background, we can get started into the questions.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and would have been nice to make a trip back to Cleveland, but obviously that's not possible in this environment. I'll give you a quick background as to how I got from Case to investment banking to the entertainment industry and now working in coffee. I was always curious how people got from point A to point F in their careers. So I'll just give a quick overview, and if anybody has more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I got to Case, the JD MBA, really because of what I was doing during my college summers. I spent my summers working for the William Morris Talent Agency, and while I was there, one of my mentors, I asked him, how do I get to be in a position like you're in? He said, get an MBA. And the theory was that a lot of people in the entertainment industry at the time had law degrees, people who were running the businesses. So getting an MBA would provide this value-added skill set and perspective. So that's what led me to Case, and I spent my first year in law school, spent that first summer working in entertainment again at Sony Pictures Television. And then I did my first pivot into investment banking, although the plan was to use my investment banking skills to get back into the entertainment industry. And what I was seeking in banking was really to get hardcore finance and deal making experience, which is something I didn't have because I went right from college, where I was a communications major, into grad school. So I did that. I got a job in New York City at Prudential Securities after grad school in their investment banking group. Phenomenal experience, did that for a couple of years until I felt like I got out of it what I wanted to, and then started looking for ways to get back into the entertainment industry. I won't go into too many details unless somebody has a question later on, but essentially what I did was my brother had been working for some big media companies, and he started a talent advisory and project development company, which I thought was a really interesting component of the entertainment industry and something I wanted to be a part of, because it allowed me to have exposure to both the creative side of entertainment, which I was interested in, and the business side. And also, if I started my own company, I could start my entrepreneur career. So I wound up joining forces with my brother. I moved to LA, and we ran a company together for many years. But there was something missing for me, even as we built a very successful company. I was looking for something more than just being an advisor. I had spent so many years in banking and entertainment. Being essentially an advisor, I joined some boards. I was looking for something where I could have more ownership and see projects from start to finish. And so I was, for many years, was looking for either companies to start or to take an active investor role in, or to buy. And eventually I came across Barefoot Coffee Roasters, which, again, I'm happy to go into more details as to how that came about, but it checked all of the boxes for me, or a lot of the boxes for me. One of which was I wanted to be in business with my wife, which is something that we do together as we run the company. We had been interested in coffee, but also we were drawn to products that were elevated, but accessible, something you can enjoy on a daily or a weekly basis. And that's what we do at Barefoot, is we take a really fantastic, delicious product and it's accessible and it's affordable. And so that we were really drawn to that and Barefoot's ethos. So we bought the company, and currently we have a roasting facility in Silicon Valley, a training lab in Silicon Valley. We have a cafe in Silicon Valley. We're building another one there. And we have a cafe in San Diego. We have two sort of separate operating entities, one of which is our cafe operations, and the other is our wholesale coffee roasting, where we roast not only for our cafes, but for other restaurants, cafes, offices, universities, specialty markets, and we distribute as a wholesaler. So basically we're seeing both ends of the industry now, on the wholesale side being affected by COVID, and also the cafe side as well.
Thank you for your introduction. Again, as Michael wrote, if anyone has any questions moving forward into the hour, feel free to use the chat function, the raise hand feature, and I can call on you. But I think a good starting point would be to address the elephant in the room. Could you speak to how COVID-19 has affected what you do, your operations, and what responses you see from peers in the industry?
Good question. Again, we have two separate entities and businesses. Our wholesale side, there was a day in March when in the Bay Area, I should say, they announced the shelter in place, and everything came to a halt. All of our wholesale accounts basically stopped ordering. The universities were closed, offices started closing. But our retail, our market, our specialty markets, and our web orders started exploding. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It was very scary, I should say, when all of your clients stop ordering all at once. It's very scary. And on the cafe side, that happened as well, where both of our cafes remained operational, but in the very, very early stages, there was a significant drop-off. Thankfully, much of that has recovered for us. We're not a 5,000 square foot restaurant. We're a grab-and-go coffee. People need their coffee. They need to buy beans. They want to get an excellent cup of coffee. So very, very fortunate. But at the same time, there's been monumental changes in the industry. And, while one of our cafes has recovered very, very nicely, the other one isn't where it was last year. And one of the differences is that the one that hasn't recovered as well doesn't have very much patio seating. And right now in California, there's no indoor seating allowed at any restaurants. So we're starting to see shifts. You drive through, whether it's retail centers or even street pedestrian streets, where they're converting garages, parking lots, parking spaces into outdoor seating to address the need for restaurants to survive.
You mentioned that your customers in general have this need for the coffee, for the product. Would you say that the pandemic and sort of its effects on the overall economy, how has that impacted the overall demand for coffee, for consumer, I guess I'll throw around the term luxury or elevated consumer goods? What is your stance on that?
We haven't seen an adverse effect. We've actually had to raise some of our prices very reluctantly because, interestingly, our vendors have increased prices significantly. Like milk prices skyrocketed because they went from having a surplus. A lot of the dairy farms in California, when all the restaurants shut down, there was a massive surplus where they literally were dumping milk, to all of a sudden there was a shortage as restaurants started opening or finding their footing in terms of how to operate, but then production was significantly lower because the dairy farms were laying people off and trying to social distance. So we've had to raise prices, and that has not adversely affected us. I think we're still, to be honest, we're still in the weeds here. Just as my opinion is as a global pandemic issue right now. I don't think we've seen the worst of what's happened in the economy. And so I'll be curious to see what happens over the next several months. LinkedIn just laid off almost 1,000 workers, and that could continue as cases rise, or we can't get this under control. But as far as coffee goes, we're selling a lot of beans online and through the specialty markets where prices have remained the same. Whole Foods doesn't change their prices; they are what they are. So,
I believe Brian Sokol has a question for you. Brian.
Hey, Jon. You started to touch upon it, but yeah, how do you compete with the national and the large regional chains that are surrounding you?
The large chains like the Pete's and the Starbucks.
Right. Yeah. Coffee Bean, so forth.
It's really a different market segment. On the one hand, anybody who serves a drink or anybody who serves coffee, you could deem they're a competitor, but our product and it's something that we've tried to educate, and our specialty coffee, call it third wave coffee, has tried to educate consumers over the last many years. Like, why are we preparing coffee the way we do? Why are we talking about coffee in terms of, the actual flavor notes as opposed to the roast profile? And that education has gone a long way, so that for the most part, people who are coming to us, they're not really also going to one of the big coffee companies where, saying this delicately, the level of quality across the board, from drinks to drink ingredients to food, is so much higher and so much more elevated with what we do. Good. I love your background, by the way.
I thought you might like that. Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess sort of along that tangent, do you anticipate any growth opportunities for companies such as yourself?
It's a good question. There are growth opportunities, but there's so many unknowns. Sadly, there's a lot of cafes and restaurants going out of business. That does present opportunities in terms of space available. California is I guess I'd put it in a market like sort of New York City, and the major cities within California, throughout the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego County, where rents are really high. We have to factor that in as well. Like, for us, when we look at an opportunity, it's not just, is that is that a good location? It's what's the rent? Why did the previous tenant go out of business? So I'm evaluating some opportunities now, but landlords really have not budged very much, and they're not traditionally they don't like to. And I think until the market shows them that somebody's not going to come into that space, or if somebody does, they're going to go out really quickly at the ask rents. We're being very careful about anything we commit to going forward.
I believe Michael has a question.
Sure. So Jon, I was curious when you were talking about your decision to come here to Case's, a little kind of more career journey than kind of the moment you are right now, but the decision to come back and get an MBA and a law degree. I'm sort of curious, like when folks go to you for advice about the value of a business degree, and you kind of reflect on your career and investment banking and what you're doing now. I mean, do you feel that the MBA gave you tools that you use now? How much of it was the piece of paper on your wall? I'm sort of curious as you look back on that decision to come get 2 graduate degrees. What pieces do you think were important in going back to school?
It's a great question. You know, when I was actually interviewing for investment banking jobs and people asked me why I did the JD MBA, I would say I went to law school because it's difficult to learn law without going to law school and get some of those analytical skills. But clearly the MBA and the skills I developed there and what put me in a position to get a job on Wall Street, I used probably 80 to 90% more of what the MBA and investment banking gave me than law. I mean, because when I read a lease, for instance, if a landlord presents me with a lease, I took real estate law, but we weren't reading real estate leases, and we weren't going through like terms and what's negotiable and what's not. Those are things you learn when you actually work at a law firm, and you start practicing and learning the nuances of that. Same with the entertainment industry. When I would read a TV contract or a movie contract, it wasn't anything I learned in law school so much. It was more the thinking. And so the MBA was really important. I was a communications major in college, and I didn't have any finance or accounting background, which is critical to so much of what I do now. So yeah, it's definitely much more than a piece of paper.
Regarding your educational background, is there a lesson that you've learned in your career that you would have preferred to have learned early on in your education, or is there something you would have wanted to tell a previous version of yourself just starting out?
It's a good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is both business school and law school, they teach you about negotiating and how it's a successful negotiation when both sides don't get exactly what they want. And yet the reality is, I don't know that I've experienced that or experienced it very much. I mean, it is whoever has the leverage exploits it to the extent that they can. I've seen it time and time again. Sometimes it's worked to my favor, but for the most part, we're negotiating with big landlords or to take over companies. I'm an investor in various companies and private equity funds, and it literally comes down to if the buyer has more leverage than the seller or vice versa, they're going to exploit that and really kind of understanding that. So I guess early on it would have been nice because negotiations you can take things personally, which you really shouldn't. But I think it's important to sort of look at everything and make sure that for entrepreneurs, if they're looking to buy companies or get involved, that you just sort of analyze as many aspects as you can and you make the right decision. And if one of those deal terms doesn't sit well with you, just trust your guts and walk away. Excellent advice.
Do you notice a common mistake that early entrepreneurs are making when they're stepping out and sort of releasing a new line of products or even entering your industry? Do you see a pattern or something that you would advise against?
I mean, there are going to be mistakes, always mistakes, and every day I'm presented with how do we allocate our resources, financially, time, all of that, and when there is a problem, a fire or a mistake, how does it get fixed? I think for an early entrepreneur, in terms of what I do and kind of what I touched upon, a lot of restaurants and cafes, I think, set themselves up for failure early on if they don't enter into a favorable lease. Not even a favorable lease. If they enter into a lease where they haven't evaluated the consequences of how much that monthly payment is, along with the triple nets, how much the lease is the rent is going to escalate per year, especially in California. And I think that's why you see a lot of failures, in particular in the restaurant industry, is people just not getting a handle on their food costs, their labor costs. You know, when we opened up a new cafe in San Diego last fall, and it was the first one that we opened from start to finish. And in the middle of opening, we decided we wanted to make sure we were fully staffed, that there was a competitor down the street, and the biggest complaint was that the lines were really long. And so we were overstaffed to the point of, when I stepped back a few months later to evaluate it, my wife and I would talk about it. We're like, we need to start cutting staff, because those are things where, between the staff and the rent, not controlling your food costs or food waste, you will go out of business very quickly. In California, where rents are very, very high.
Understandable. I see that Elizabeth has a question. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I was just wondering if, at any point, maybe earlier on, when like the pandemic hit, if you had like any issues with like the supply chain, because I know that like some other industries, especially like the tech industry, had some problems there, but I was just wondering if you had any in the coffee industry.
Great question. We didn't have supply chain issues with our beans, because when we buy beans, we're committing to a certain amount of bags that are going to last us for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it is. And they're already in port, actually at a warehouse in Oakland. We didn't have that issue, but we did have an issue with our retail bags. Our vendor actually forgot to place an order, and the lead times on custom bags are like 8 to 10 weeks. And I realized that about a month in, so meaning like a month away from when we're supposed to get our bags, they didn't even place the order. And then there were further delays because of the pandemic, shipping from Taiwan. And the reason that was a major issue for us was because we had transitioned from, on the wholesale side, we were mainly selling I shouldn't say mainly, but the bulk of our orders were 5 pound and 2.5 pound bags, much easier to fill and process than our custom 12 ounce retail bags, which were much more labor intensive at a time when we had fortuitously lost a couple people without us having to actually let go of them right at the beginning of the pandemic, and then not replacing them. But it really strained our staff, and there continues to be some strain on our staff, because so much of what we're doing now are those custom bags. But that was really the main thing. I don't know if people are seeing it across the country, but in California, just certain prices have increased. I mentioned the milk. US beef prices have increased, so it's actually cheaper to buy grass-fed beef from Australia than it is to buy beef from a farm that, raised in Northern California. So it's really been more pricing than it has been any supply chain product issues.
Great, thank you.
If anyone on the Zoom call or listening via LinkedIn has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat or use the raise hand feature.
Do we have coffee drinkers on the program? Everybody drink coffee? No. Oh yes.
Oh, yes.
Well, I'll just say this: it's an interesting part of the field that we're in. We call it third wave. The first wave of coffee was, basically the instant coffee that our great, depending on how old people are, great grandparents were drinking at the turn of the century. And Starbucks was really the one that started the second wave of coffee, making it more of an experience. And then what happened with third wave coffees is companies like Barefoot, and Barefoot's been around since 2003, is our goal was really to go out and source what we call culinary coffees and responsibly source culinary coffees. That means going to the farm level, either our team have been there or the importers that we work with have been to the farm level to see that the farmers are taken care of, there's sustainable agricultural practices being employed, whether it's renewable energy or composting. Some of the coffees that we source, they have a story to them, but then roasting in a culinary manner. And so basically with Barefoot, if you look at our labels or labels of our competitors, we're talking about coffee in terms of the actual flavor notes that we taste, kind of like wine. But as I mentioned earlier, it's been a bit of an education because the way, Starbucks and the other big companies have talked about coffee over the years, it's been more about the roast profile. Is it light? Is it dark? Is it bold? Is it strong? And those are words that are difficult for us to, although we've had to do that more, but those are difficult words for us to actually use when we're describing our coffee. But it also goes to the heart of what's happening in the coffee industry, where there's so many different ways to enjoy coffee, which is a blessing and a curse. If somebody says to me, oh, what coffee should I drink? Or what coffee should I buy? I don't know. Like, do you drink espresso? Do you drink espresso with milk? Are you drinking mochas? Do you drink pour overs or French press? And do you like, more chocolatey notes and that more traditional sort of quote darker roast profile? Or are you looking for a more tea-like cup? So on the one hand, it's challenging to get the right coffee to people the way they want to enjoy it, but it's also what really drew Jillian and myself to the industry is having just this exceptional culinary product.
I believe Michael has a question.
Sure. So, I'm curious, Jon, with your background on the finance side and now being an entrepreneur sort of in the food space, I'm curious if you can sort of comment on, at least in the venture capital world, like food entrepreneurship traditionally had not been kind of a hot space. But over the past few years, that's changed. I'm not sure in the COVID time what the dynamics are, but I'm sort of curious if you can comment on how you've seen kind of food entrepreneurship as a category become more attractive to venture and angel investors along the way.
I don't know that I have a great deal of information to fully address that. I think in the Bay Area, you have Impossible Meats, which obviously attracted the Bay Area venture funds. Ventures typically stayed away from restaurant and food concepts. It's traditionally been more of a private equity play, but just by virtue of people having a lot of money in the Bay Area or throughout California and seeing a lot of concepts, even on the coffee roasting side, Blue Bottle was one of the early ones that got funding from some big name venture people. I think because they're just a fan of the product. They weren't necessarily a venture company per se, but I don't have a ton of information on how some startups would necessarily get funded beyond just a friends and family. At Stumptown too is another big name where they were both, Stumptown and Blue Bottle were also developing a lot of different products, including a bottled cold brew, which they had planned to roll out on a national level. We started a bottled cold brew at the same time, but had very limited space in which to do it. And while it's won a lot of awards and fantastic, it wasn't something that we were necessarily looking to roll out. But it would have been interesting to go out and get funding for that.
Great, thanks.
I believe we have a couple of questions lined up. Our first one is from Domingo.
I'm curious, do you find that it's necessary to have a roastery as well as cafes because it's strategically necessary, or can you survive in either space and really concentrate on that? I guess it's kind of a question in terms of vertical integration.
That's a great question. I think a cafe can stand independently. There are roasters who do, but I think some of the roasters that don't have the cafe exposure probably are the bigger roasters that are selling to like the Costco's. Not that that's a bad thing at all. Costco has actually been interested in getting into more specialty products across the board. But for us, Barefoot started as a roastery and a cafe, and the roastery under the founder exploded very quickly in the Bay Area. So our goal is to have some more cafes because it allows us to control what I would argue is probably the most complex culinary product there is. So for us to be able to control the customer experience, not that obviously we still want to have wholesale accounts and we train our wholesale accounts, but for customers to be able to come in and experience a Barefoot Coffee drink the way we intend it, that's really important for us, that vertical integration. Good question.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Bob Sopko. Bob, go ahead.
Hi. So I've got I'm a somewhat of a coffee drinker. My son-in-law is a coffee snob, and he knows all about coffee. And he was explaining to me that light colored coffee has more caffeine than dark coffee, and that was a little bit surprising to me. Can you kind of give us some of the chemistry or information behind that and what your thoughts are on it? Thank you.
That's a great question as well, Bob. If you Google that, you will find different beliefs about that. I would say part of what that stems from is that a quote light roasted coffee. We talk about coffee in terms of development time. When coffee reaches a certain temperature, it's called the first crack, and from first crack on is when you start seeing the chemistry changes in the coffee and then bringing about the flavors. And the more developed a coffee is, and when it gets to a point of like a second crack, that's a very dark roasted coffee. So you're going to find the beans are darker. A lot of times you'll see oily coffee, which is not what you want in beans, quality beans. And so the theory for that was that a dark roasted coffee is going to roast out some more of the caffeine. But where you find people differing in opinion about that is just the density of the bean changes, because beans, there's a lot of water in them that starts evaporating in the roasting process. And so when you grind coffee beans, so when we brew coffee at our cafe at home, what we recommend is it's just like baking. You need to dose out the right amount of coffee beans on the right grind setting for however you're preparing it. Use the right amount of water, the right temperature, and the right time. And so when you take, say, 20 grams of coffee that's been roasted at different development times, there's going to be a different density there. So to answer your question, it could be a little bit more caffeine in a lighter roasted bean, but it also depends on how you're grinding it and how much weight you're actually adding to your brew process, because that can affect the caffeine too. Some tests have been done that say it's fairly negligible. I will say that if you drink cold brew coffee, you're going to find that to be often very highly concentrated. Cold brew, for those of you who don't know, it's a process where coffee never touches hot water. It's a cold or room temperature extracted coffee that steeps like tea over the course of 20 to 24 hours, and it develops into a really rich concentrate that then gets diluted. So a lot of times you'll find a rich, strong caffeine content in those, but it's not really related to the roast profile, the light or the dark.
So it depends.
It depends. It depends on what you're reading. You know, I feel like when I drink, the way I drink coffee and I weigh coffee out, I feel like lighter roast is a little bit more potent to me from a caffeine standpoint. So I would subscribe to that. But, you know, again, that's with me dosing out the right amount of grinds.
Okay, thanks.
I did not expect to learn about the intricacies of coffee itself, but I'm glad I know all of this now. I can impress everyone in conversation.
Chemistry was not one of my better classes in high school, but coffee really is so much chemistry. And from a roasting standpoint, you know, there's roasters out there that you push a button and you walk away from the machine, and 12, 14 minutes later, the coffee's ready. And at companies like Barefoot, we're roasting on smaller machines where we have, on the one hand, sophisticated computer programs that are charting various parameters that then allow our roasters to make adjustments to temperature and airflow, because the rate of temperature rise is critical, can affect the roast afterwards. But our roasters are using their eyes, they're looking at the color of the beans as they're roasting. And over a period of time, they're using their nose to smell the aromas, using their ears to listen for that, as I mentioned, the first crack. And then every day they're doing what's called cupping, which is the previous day's roast. They're doing quality control, essentially, to taste the coffee to make sure that it's coming out with the flavor profile we're trying to achieve, and to make changes as necessary, which are necessary because coffee, again, chemistry, it's affected by the atmospheric pressure, it's affected by the temperature and the humidity in the warehouse, the fluctuations in the Bay Area, where in the winter it could be 38 degrees overnight, you know, and 68, 70 degrees during the day. So they're constantly changing, making slight changes to the roast profile. And that's just at the roasting level. The brewing is a whole different set of parameters that need to be used and protocols. And it's why a lot of times, you know, you're going to get your best shot of espresso at a cafe where, you know, they've been trained to dial in espresso and get it tasting the way that the roasters had intended it to taste. So yeah, there's a lot of chemistry involved in coffee, roasting and preparation.
It looks like Elizabeth has another question. Elizabeth?
Yeah, basically a good follow-up to this is, like, you know, you obviously are very knowledgeable on coffee now, but were you as knowledgeable before you started running Barefoot, or did you have like a really big learning curve when you first went into that?
Great question. Very, very big learning curve. And my wife and I were very interested in coffee. We had been exploring specialty coffee. Just a quick story for those entrepreneurs or some people who might be looking for companies to buy. The groundwork was laid for me, where there was a coffee roaster in LA who only sold beans out of a store. You couldn't get a cup of coffee there, which I thought was, on the one hand, very cool, and on the other hand, I felt like there was a lot of upside being lost there. And I heard that the owner might be interested in selling the company. He had locations in another city. And so I called him to say, hey, I want to buy your company. And he said, oh, I'm not for sale, but I didn't believe him. And so one of the things that's really important across the board is just being persistent. I did not believe him, but I sent him letters. I sent him emails trying to explain who I was and what I was looking to do. And we did then start a dialogue. We met in person many times. And I was very interested in buying his company. And through that process, learned a lot about coffee. And then found and then sort of the next steps in me looking, I wasn't just looking for coffee companies, but when I did come across Barefoot, I had learned more. I had a base of knowledge, but then, I mean, honestly, it wasn't even until we took over that we really started learning so much about the coffee industry. And so on, you know, you go in and you think you kind of not know it all, but you think you know enough to get by. But, you know, we had a really strong team in place, and while we've had turnover since then, we just have a really good foundation of great people on our cafe side and our roasting side. And one of the tenets of what we do is education. We do a lot of classes up in the Bay Area, and I love actually attending classes because, or just hearing our baristas train a fellow barista, because there's just nuances that I'll pick up. Always learning it's just a great thing. It just makes you a better operator and more knowledge about coffee in general. So
it looks like we have time for one more question. This next one is from Hiju, so go for it.
Hello. So I basically have two questions. Do you see a continual demand for sustainability, such as packaging, shipping, and other issues, and organic options from customers? And I also love how you're incorporating classes to spread the culture, just the coffee culture, and then enjoy coffee in diverse ways. So who are the class participants, and how diverse is the group, and how do you get the insights from them?
Okay, very good questions. The sustainability is something that's it's very important to us. I say us, my wife and myself, but also the people who work for Barefoot are very socially conscious and environmentally conscious. I will say we can't do everything that we'd want to do. Not everything that we have is organic in terms of our offerings at our cafes. Not every single coffee that we have is organic or uses renewable energy, although we seek those out, and we try to balance, here's a coffee that we want, or we typically address like a profile, like we want a complex, single origin, fruity, citrusy, and then we try to find the best coffee available, and typically we try to find something that, if it's not organic, the farm is de facto organic. A lot of farms can't afford the certification, or it comes from farms where they are doing sustainable practices. But we have to balance: are the beans good, and what's the price point? Because sometimes the price point is beyond what we could then turn around and sell coffee for. So we have to take those things into consideration across the board. And that applies at our cafe level too, where the bulk of the important items that we're sourcing, like in San Diego, for instance, where organic is much more important to the customer, having organic milk, organic and cage-free eggs, like organic ice cream, like as much as we can find organic, we do. And there is a demand for it, certainly in San Diego, and parts of the Bay Area. We don't see it as much at our current Bay Area cafe, but it's something that we're always, trying to address. Like, can we afford that based on what we can ultimately charge to the customer, so that they're not, shell shocked by the price. As far as the question, I hope that answered your question, but and feel free to ask a follow-up. But as far as the classes go, we do a lot for our customers. So like we work with a lot of offices in the Bay Area that buy coffee from us, and we'll do group offsites, bonding sessions for them. And we typically present them with, here are some options that you can do. This is what works with your group size. This is what you're going to learn. This is what we recommend based on, if you have 4 people or 14 people. But it's actually helped us get more customers, because even at the retail level, because once people start understanding what it is that we do, or understanding how to make coffee the way you're supposed to make coffee, all of a sudden they're not, shell shocked by a $16 or $17 bag of coffee.
Thank you.
It looks like we are running just a little bit low on time. If anyone has any questions moving forward, perhaps a coffee recommendation, Michael did put Jon's LinkedIn in the chat. But thank you everyone for participating or listening in today. Thank you, Jon, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll just turn it over to Michael.
Right. Jon, thanks for doing this. It is great to connect. It's fun hearing your voyage from the media and entertainment world to investment banking to coffee, which is fun and I think suits your wandering personality with many interests. And it's awesome to know that at different phases in life, particularly as our students listen to this, like you can do many different things. So thank you for taking the time to share the journey with us and at least come back to Cleveland via Zoom. But we do look forward to having you back on campus when you're in town.
Thank you, Michael. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to send me an email, Jon@barefootcoffee.com.